Wow. Thank you all. Good evening, everyone. We filled the place. I'm very, very happy. My name's Tom McIntosh. I'm the Associate Dean of Arts for Research and Graduate Studies here at the University of Regina. And on behalf of Dean Tobias Spurluck, who could not be here this evening, and the entire Faculty of Arts, I want to welcome you to the 2026 Woodrow Lloyd Lecture. To begin, I want to acknowledge that we gather here in the territories of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. In saying that, I'm reminded of the words of Cree writer, lawyer, and activist Harold Johnson, who in his book, Two Families, Treaty and Government, wrote this: "My cousin, that is what my elders said to call you. You have a treaty right to occupy and use this territory. You received that right when my family adopted yours. But that treaty right was not intended to lead to the subjugation and impoverishment of the First Nations and Métis peoples with whom we as settlers were supposed to share this land. And so, as we reflect on what it means for all of us to be treaty people, we're called upon to acknowledge and correct the wrongs of the past and of the present, and to look to a future that makes manifest the promise of the treaties. That is, to my mind, the very least that one cousin owes to another." Tonight's lecture is presented in recognition of the contribution to education of Woodrow Stanley Lloyd, who served as the 8th Premier of the province of Saskatchewan from 1961 to 1964. He is perhaps best known for being the Premier that implemented Medicare in the province in the aftermath of the divisive doctors' strike in 1962. But before that, as Minister of Education, he was a strong and vocal advocate for the expansion of post-secondary education in the province, and indeed laid the cornerstone of the first building of the Regina campus of the University of Saskatchewan. That campus, of course, became, in 1974, the University of Regina. The lecture is funded through the generosity of the Woodrow Lloyd Trust and is presented each winter. I want to thank the members of the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture Committee, Mohammed Asadallah from the Department of Justice Studies, Brett Dolter from the Department of Economics, and Don Martin, Executive Director of the Regina Community Clinic, for their time and effort in choosing tonight's speaker. And I really want to thank Emily Lintz for her work in organizing and dealing with all of the logistics for tonight's event, including eventually securing access to the 2 wings of this room so that we could all be here. Now, the Lloyd Trust charges us to invite a nationally or internationally recognized scholar, writer, thinker, and/or activist to speak on issues of direct relevance to Saskatchewan. People who know me will know I don't often quote George W. Bush, but let me just say, mission accomplished. Tim Caulfield is a professor in the Faculty of Law and the School of Public Health, and research director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta. And he was a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy for over 20 years, from 2002 to 2023. I first came across the work of Tim Caulfield when I worked in the very early 2000s as the research coordinator for the Commission on the Future of Healthcare in Canada. We were in the process of looking to commission some 40 research papers by both established and new healthcare scholars as part of our overall research agenda. And at that time, a colleague, Colleen Flood, then of the University of Toronto and now Dean of Law at Queen's University, said to me, "You should get in touch with Tim Caulfield at U of A. He'll do excellent work for the commission." And so I did, and so he did. Tim's career bears all the hallmarks of an academic superstar. Some might say overachiever. He has published 400 plus academic articles in a diverse range of health fields. He's a member of the Order of Canada, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. But to my mind, at least, what is most impressive about Tim's work is that amidst all of the scholarly output, Tim has built a national and international reputation as one of the most foremost public communicators of health policy information, one of the most high-profile debunkers and critics of health misinformation and disinformation. He is tireless in his mission to combat public health illiteracy and to expose the hucksters, the fraudsters, and the conspiracy theorists that have wreaked havoc on public health systems, not just in Canada and in the US, but increasingly across the globe. And he is the author of a book with what is easily my favorite subtitle of all times, The Science of Celebrity, or Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything? How can you not love a book with that kind of a title? And so that leads us, or his most recent book, that The Certainty Illusion, What You Don't Know and Why It Matters, came out in paperback in January, and it's been described as a brilliant and accessible deep dive into the complexities of our modern misinformation crisis. And that leads us directly to the topic of tonight's lecture. The knowledge crisis, how did we get here, and what can we do? Please join me in welcoming the 2026 Woodrow Lloyd Lecturer, Timothy Caulfield.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, you guys. Such a privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you about something I feel incredibly passionate about, and so honored to be giving this presentation in the name of an individual that has done so much for healthcare, foundational to healthcare, but I think also fair to say to the production of knowledge, So I think this topic is perfect for this crowd, and I hope you agree, for this event, and thank you again for this opportunity. I am going to talk about what I think is one of the greatest challenges of our time. That sounds like hyperbole, but I don't think it is. And I'm going to make that argument over the next 40 minutes or so. We really are living in the middle of a knowledge crisis, right? A knowledge crisis. In fact, last year, I know you guys maybe saw this, it was picked as the year of the lie, right? And 2026 is worse, right? It's already worse. And if we just look at it through the lens of health, and I'll be primarily doing that tonight, but not exclusively, we know it's bad, right? This was a very recent editorial from The Lancet where they talk about the destruction that RFK Jr. is doing to the knowledge base in the United States, in the health context, but not just in the health context, right? It is bad. This is a crisis. It is a crisis, and I've been at this for decades, as highlighted, and I've never seen anything like I'm seeing right now. But I think it's always important to have some context, right? It's bad now, but it's been bad for a while. Now, one really important point that I don't think is made enough is captured by this Lancet editorial that came out last year. I think this is an incredibly important point. I know there's healthcare providers in the room and there's academics in the room, and they've probably felt this. There is more distrust in institutions now. Research consistently shows that. But that distrust has largely been manufactured, right? Largely been created. As this editorial highlights, disinformation has become a deliberate instrument to attack and discredit scientists and healthcare professionals for political gain. And I think that is a very important point that we're going to come back to in a bit. Okay, so I don't have a whole bunch of time with you, so I want to make a couple of very obvious points, and this is one of them. And again, something that you've probably thought of already. What I am talking about is misinformation. And those who critique, the research on misinformation, and those of us who want to sort of regulate misinformation often say, well, how come you get to decide what is misinformation and what isn't misinformation? Look, if you believe in the Enlightenment, if you believe in the scientific process, the fallible scientific process that is a human endeavor that nudges us closer, but maybe never getting there, to a closer objective picture of reality, then what I am talking about is misinformation. Given the current body of evidence that we have, which is always evolving, there are things that aren't true, right? The world is not flat. Agree? Maybe there's one or two flat earthers out there. Speak up. Aliens did not build the pyramids. Agreed? Right? Maybe you didn't know about this one. In August 12th, Earth's gravity is going to disappear for 7 seconds. I could be proven wrong on this one. We went to the moon, right? Right? And Biden was not executed and replaced by clones. That's a lie. Does everyone agree? Right? And while this one might feel real, the world is not run by lizard people. All those things are demonstrably false. They're misinformation. But there are other ideas that I think are equally false, that are flat earth ideas. This was a survey that was done by the Canadian Medical Association. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but I want to highlight one. And this is the lie. The lie. It's always been a lie, and it's still a lie, right? Given the body of evidence that we have, the lie that vaccines cause autism. But look at this is a flat earth idea, right? Look at the number of Canadians, and I'm not blaming these people, I'm blaming the chaotic information environment. Look at the number of Canadians that are at least open to this idea, and that number is increasing. Now, I've been dancing around this a little bit, and I want to be really careful how I present this, because the embrace and spread of misinformation happens across the ideological divide, right? And the reason I started with that story is I think it's important to recognize that it kind of, ping-pongs between left and right, especially in the health space. But right now, the degree to which health misinformation is tethered to political identity is absolutely incredible, right? In the United States, and by the way, especially in my province of Alberta, your vaccination I'll put it this way. The most predictive variable of whether you're vaccinated in the United States is your political identity. It's stronger than race, it's stronger than education, income, it's even stronger than insurance coverage, which is incredible in the United States. To be fair, a lot is baked into that variable, right? But still, that is remarkable. Here's a relatively recent study to show how it's changed, right? It wasn't always this way, right? Earlier in my career, actually for most of my career, lots of the anti-vax rhetoric came from the left. Now it's entirely on the right, which is incredible, right? Really, really incredible. And I'm not saying this for partisan reasons. I'm saying this because it's important to understand what's going on. Okay, the other very obvious point I want to make is this one. Yeah, it's social media. Social media has changed. It's completely transformed how we get our information. And studies show, now this is how people, as this study highlights, this is how people get their information, right? Social media, especially for the younger demographic, is where people get their news, where they get their information about science. It's where they get their entertainment. Social media rules, right? And that is important to recognize because we know the algorithms that drive social media invite those extreme ideas. Those algorithms reward rage, they reward fear, and they reward extreme content. There's a large body of evidence on this now. I'm going to highlight just one study I often use because I think it really captures what's going on. This study found no surprise to anyone in this room. The more extreme the content it is, right, the more likely it's to get clicks, get shares. But the other reason I think this study is interesting is it highlights that we all live in echo chambers to a lesser or greater extent, right? And if you live in a particular echo chamber, your view may not be extreme anymore. Let me put it this way: if you live in the I drink urine, echo chamber, that's not so extreme anymore. So you have to make it aged urine, right? Or you have to make it a urine enema in order to get the same response. So there's a very destructive cycle of extreme content built into the algorithms. And yes, it's all about rage, right? It really is all about rage. This is a study that came out not that long ago that it published in Science. It found exactly that, right? The more it's about fear, the more about rage, because it plays to our negativity bias, which is a very strong cognitive bias, but it also plays to our tribe, to our team, right? This is what our team believes. This is one of my favorite examples. This is the idea of pausing, of just taking a beat. So this is research that's been done by people like Gordon Pennycook. Do you guys know Gordon Pennycook? He was at the University of Regina, and he defected to Cornell University. Boo. I have the opportunity to collaborate with Gordon. Him and people like David Rand and MIT have found that just taking a beat, a pause, a break, and they're not talking about hours, they're talking about even just a moment. You're less likely to believe misinformation, less likely to spread it. And they think it's not because of some sophisticated lateral reading phenomenon. They think it's just because you disconnect from that emotional response to the content and invite a little bit of critical thinking. They call them accuracy nudges, as I said. We need to do that, but we also need to step away for a longer period of time. And I think there's a growing body of evidence, and you guys have probably seen this, it's gotten a lot of press. Step away from your phone, put your phone away. The study is pretty consistent that shows that if you do that, you can. How many people here, be honest, have your phone on your bed night, beside your bed at night? Wow, a lot of hands. Yeah, shame on you. Let's shame them. No. Putting your phone away really can make a difference. This was a study, and there have been a bunch of studies on this. Again, you should be careful not to overinterpret this data. A lot of times it's observational, or the methods are relatively thin. But I think the body of evidence tells us it really can make a difference. It has a significant impact, not just on critical thinking, but on mental health and your overall well-being. This is something that I think institutions like the University of Regina, for example, could perhaps even play a bigger role in. And this is the idea of embracing and explaining the nature of the scientific consensus. So, what do I mean by that? The scientific consensus is not, a memo we get from the star chamber, right? The scientific consensus is, hundreds and sometimes thousands of studies that kind of point in a particular direction, right? It's always evolving, it's messy, it's contested. And their studies say if you explain that to people, the scientific consensus can become very persuasive, even for those who are skeptical. This is a study that I really like. It was done in Europe that really tackles this topic. And what they did, it's a really interesting study. They ask people, what do you think? What do you think the experts, so the PhDs, the clinicians, what do you think the experts think about the COVID vaccine? Got that? So what do you think the experts think about the COVID vaccine? And 4 out of 5 people said, well, I think the experts are split. 50% think it's a good idea, 50% think it's a bad idea. That's false balance, right? That's doubt mongering at play. When, as this audience probably knows, there's almost, among experts, universal acceptance, right, that it's safe and effective, and really a remarkable scientific breakthrough. And we are starting to see organizations speak up and step up and organize. We need to see more of this in Canada. I'm trying to do that with groups across Canada right now. We need organizations to step up and say, this is what the scientific consensus actually is. And as I said, we're seeing this happen in the United States. It's making a real difference. This is a study that, again, from the University of Pennsylvania that got a lot of attention. And I think this data reflects this response. This is good news. So this is a study that asks, who do you have confidence in the context of public health? Who do they believe in? Primary care people. They believe in real scientists. Do they believe in RFK Jr.? No, right? And I think that is a result of people speaking up and talking about what the science actually says. This is our effort to do that. It's called #ScienceUpFirst, where we try to make engaging, content for all audiences. It's written by, not me, wonderful, diverse voices from across Canada. I hope we're making a real difference. Follow us on your favorite platform. We'd love to have you join the Science Up First team. And with that, I want to say thank you very, very much for this opportunity. And I'll end with my two favorite words: go science. Thank you, guys. Do you have time for questions? Time for some questions? Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, I have so many questions. You were also online way more than I am. I didn't know any of those influencers, and now I'm quite glad I don't. We have two microphones, one in each of the main aisles. So if you have, we have some time for questions. So if you have questions, line up. I'll let Tim moderate his own question and answer. You can go left and right and go back again. But while people are deciding who's going to be the brave one to stand at a microphone first, I'm going to ask a question. And this occurred to me during the talk. That reliance on the memes and the influencers and all of that, is there any evidence to suggest, or is it reasonable possibly to suppose, that some of that is driven by frustrations with the failings of our own healthcare system?
Yes.
Access to doctors, all of that.
So the answer is yes.
Okay.
And in fact, the Canadian Medical Association, in their study, they explored that exact question. Look, and it's one of those, there's researchers in the room, it's one of those questions that's hard to drill down on, because it's often patients' perceptions. You ask them, is this one of the reasons? And they say yes. But I think, it's completely plausible. So the idea is you don't have a primary care physician, and it works two ways, right? To ask these questions of, or to, you have the content you want to ask someone, is this true, right? And so having better access to primary care, I think would make, especially a multidisciplinary team, would make, a real difference. Great question. Yeah.
All right, this thing's on, perfect. So my name's Tori. I'm a grade 11 student at Campbell, so I grow up with all this AI stuff in my life on a day-to-day basis. My question to you is, what are three, what you say, pillars of truth to look at to what discerns misinformation or what could possibly be harmful to ourselves and to others, so we don't just forward it on, like you said earlier in your lecture, just forward without actually going to the link or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And there's so many things, what are the red flags, right? What are the red flags? So I think one of the red flags, so Kate Starwood is one of my favorite scholars in this area, and I actually interviewed her for something I was working on, and I asked her this question, right? I asked her this, and I thought she'd say, oh, Tim, do the lateral reading. Do you know what that is? Like where you check open a new browser and see what other voices are saying about that topic. That's still really important. But you know what she said? Her number one bit of advice is, if it feels like your team, so you're looking at the content, if it feels like your team just scored a touchdown, that should be reason to pause, right? Because it's playing to your cognitive biases, it's playing to your preconceived I love that bit of advice because it happens to all of us, right? And when I've fallen for misinformation, and yes, I have, it's exactly that is how it played out. So that's one thing I would do. Always ask yourself, are they trying to sell me something, and not just a product, but an agenda, an ideology, a brand? That I think should also be a red flag, but let's emphasize the selling something. I already talked about supplements. If someone's trying to sell you a supplement, a red flag, I think that's very, very important. And yes, always ask yourself, how does this play out against the scientific consensus? And that may seem like a big ask, but we all know the scientific consensus on a lot of things intuitively. Exercise, smoking, vaccines. We know what the scientific. Ask yourself, because if it's too good to be true, or if it's too dramatic of a conclusion, at a minimum, you should be tremendously skeptical. I have other suggestions, but I'll stop there. Thank you for that question.
Hi there. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the regulation piece. So I'm wondering, when you talk about this as an option, are you thinking more like proactively like regulating the platforms themselves so that disinformation can't be posted, or is it more of a sort of like punitive regulation approach of we fine people who are spreading misinformation? And are there any jurisdictions doing really good work or effective work on regulating misinformation?
I chuckled when you asked the question because it's a hard question.
Yeah.
How about I go broad? When I think of regulation and policy, I think of it all the above, kind of all the above. We do need to take a multi-pronged approach, but there are also sort of political realities. And I know this both from experience, talking to politicians in Canada, but also just looking around the world, especially in North America. So what do I mean by that? Coming out, if you start banning content, rightly or not, people will immediately say freedom of expression, et cetera. When in reality, I get very frustrated by that claim because in reality, almost all of the initiatives I recommended, right, the responses happen in the marketplace of ideas, right? This is all about using the marketplace of ideas to make a difference. But also things like transparency for the algorithms, right? Having some kind of transparency with algorithms. And there also might be political appetite for more restrictive, actual policies that are restrictive. So a friend of mine, Frank Graves, he's a well-known pollster in Canada. He found that there's bipartisan support in Canada for regulating AI in the context of elections. Right? So I think there are entry points to actual regulation, right, where it's a little bit more, where you're trying to actually regulate the content. I think people feel comfortable. Hate speech, and the other thing is having regulations around specific problematic areas like AI that are deepfakes of individuals, right? I think there's bipartisan support for those kinds of things. So the regulatory response, like the McGill team is doing great work in this space. They really think, let's start with the transparency of the algorithms, because how can you be against transparency, right? Transparency of the algorithms to get a sense of how they're spreading this misinformation. It's a terrible response to a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then what do good conversations look like when you know someone is having a conspiracy kind of moment? And I've been through a few of those lately, and none of them have landed really well.
So thank you for that question, because I actually had a slide on that, and I took it out because I knew I was going to go too long, so I'm glad that you're giving me the opportunity to talk about it. And my response is you could probably guess what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is no magic wand. I think that patience, empathy, listening, use open-ended questions like what brought you to this place, why are you concerned about these things, giving people a path to credible information. The other thing that you want to do, of course, is be patient. There's really some interesting literature, sort of outside my area of discipline, talking about how maintaining the relationship is more important than changing this person's minds. And I know there's some individuals that are so toxic that maybe you do want to end this relationship, but keeping that relationship open. Having said all that, the really obvious stuff, there is some new research, and again, hard to study this whenever you're talking about behavior and behavior change and perceptions. I think you need a large interdisciplinary body of evidence to make conclusions, but there's some interesting preliminary research talking about bypassing misinformation. So what these scholars suggest, and there are a couple of teams working on this, is that you talk about your shared values. We all want our kids to be healthy. We all want a healthy environment. We want our food to be safe. What's the goal that you agree on? And then you back into the topic that you disagree with, the misinformation topic, with a positive suggestion. Now, did you hear that GMOs are actually, research has shown that GMOs can have this benefit on the environment? You back into it, and you're more likely to have success. Again, twice I've done this. Great question. Mediocre response. Thank you.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for that. I wanted to plug the work in Colombia of an intellectual doppelganger of yours who unfortunately died recently. My father-in-law wrote a bunch of books, go science type of work. Really, he was very interested in evolution, making it available to the public, accessible writing. But he wrote quite a few books in Spanish about pseudoscience, alternative medicines, and the like. And one of his great interests was the reproduction of the same bullshit story over centuries, right? The one that comes to mind is his book, Medicinas Alternativas, Alternative Medicines. The Kirlian camera, are you familiar with that one? Kirlian, K-I-R-L-E-A-N. And it's a camera that takes pictures of an aura.
Oh, yes, I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And it came up apparently in the Soviet Union around Bolshevik times. And people thought it magically to reveal something about the state of health of the person. And then it was debunked immediately when somebody discovered how the physics of it worked. But then it came up 10 years later, and then again 10 years later. And he reconstructs the capacity to resuscitate of bullshit stories. And he got perverse pleasure out of observing hoaxes and scams be transformed slightly and then pop up in different parts of the world. Hoaxes, scams, alternative medicines that do not work. Are you interested in that long-term reproduction?
I am. You can probably see me smiling as you're talking. Yeah, I absolutely am. And that's one of the reasons I started with that, that Woodstock to Tucker's testicles. And think about, one of my favorite examples is detoxification. Right, this idea that we need to detoxify our body, we need to go do all these different kinds of, get colon cleanse to detoxify our body. And the justifications for that, we have our kidneys and our liver. When you're peeing, you're detoxifying, right? But the justifications for that pseudoscience shift depending on the cultural context. So in my early days, and I think there's probably clinicians in the room who can remember this, alternative medicine was often justified based on, this is spiritual. This is a new, this isn't a scientific approach to your health. This is a holistic spiritual approach to your health. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Now now they use science-y terms to justify, it's the microbiome, or it's quantum physics. That's why you need. So yes, I'm very interested in that arc, and I think it's very, very important because depending on the justification that's being used, that informs how you should debunk it, too. But it also highlights how these stories keep coming back and these stories matter. And I also think it's really important to highlight, and I think this story does too, we should never blame the individuals, right, who are looking for answers. We should never blame the individuals. I think it's those who are, one of the things that makes me really angry is when pseudoscience or, misinformation mongers or grifters use, culturally significant approaches to health to sell products, right? It infuriates me, right? Because it's sort of the worst of both worlds. I'll stop there, but it's a fascinating point. Thank you.
Hi there. Hello. I have a question about China. They're following a model where they're regulating their influencers.
Oh, yeah.
They somehow, I heard this from a friend that influencers have to have some kind of credentials to post their stuff on social media. I don't know if it's information or misinformation. I'll let you decide on it.
Yeah, so have people heard about this? So this is the idea. If you're going to, for example, let's say you're going to push health misinformation, you have to prove you have the credentials to do it. Is that a fair way to describe?
Yes.
It's right. So, that's a really interesting, I think at a minimum, so someone asked about regulations. One of the regulations that I'm really interested in is I think we need to, so in Canada, when you're selling a health product, if you're selling, health products, you need approval by Health Canada if you claim it has a specific health benefit in the context of a disease, it's curative, etc., right? I think we need to raise the standard that if you're making a health claim saying it's going to increase your energy, it's going to help your gut, give you a happy gut, I think we need, if they're making a health claim, I think they need to have the science to support it. And I actually think we could use AI to identify the influencers that are making that claim. All right, so AI is not all bad. Because one of the reasons we're not getting at these influencers is because there's so many of them. I've talked to regulators. They just can't respond to everything. So I would like to see, I'm not 100% sure about that standard, right? Because we know that doctors can push misinformation too. Or whoever the regulator or the profession is. But I like the idea of increasing the regulatory standards in that space and giving the tools to allow regulators to act.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. I wanted to ask about what you had pointed out about consensus among expertise, or those experts. Part of the conversation out there is that this rise of misinformation reflects a decline in trust in institutions and a rejection of elitist ivory tower people, and that is why misinformation is spreading, is people are rejecting that. But seeing what you said about the consensus part being effective, I just wondered what you had to say about that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have a lot of thoughts on this, actually. So I think it's really important to also come from a place of humility when you talk about how the public views experts, because experts have made mistakes. The scientific community makes mistakes. The healthcare system has made grave mistakes. There are communities that have been treated poorly, that have justified reasons for distrusting institutions. We have to remember all of that. When we're talking about the decrease in trust and expertise. But research does tell us at this current moment in time, a lot of that distrust and expertise is having an impact has been manufactured, right? It's been largely manufactured, perhaps systemically, but it has been manufactured. And that's relevant, of course, because that, how we rebuild it, that'll inform how we rebuild trust in these institutions. But you raise what I think is a really fascinating paradox, because I didn't even touch on how our knowledge base, and again, I know there's academics here, our knowledge base is becoming more polluted with bad science and predatory journals. We have AI creating fake science. We have artificial, fake journals emerging that are being used in Senate hearings in the United States. And the paradox is, right now, experts who actually know the field are more valuable than ever, right? Because that is one of the ways we're going to get at what the scientific consensus is, what the scientific the literature actually is, at the exact moment when trust in expertise is declining. So the good news is, and I bet you know this, even in the United States, experts, so scientists, healthcare providers, is that last survey I highlighted, are still amongst the most trusted, but the trust has declined. So there was a long walk to come to this conclusion. That's why I think when we start talking about scientific consensus, we need to make sure there's a coalition of voices that are behind whatever statement we make about the scientific consensus. So let's use colon cleanses are not a good way to detox your body. That's an obvious one, but don't drink your urine. You'd have a group of voices that perhaps have different perspectives that are all trusted voices endorsing that. I think if we did that, I think it'd be more likely to get around the concern that you have.
Can I ask one just follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So if you have that consensus of voices, but you have these multitudes of influencers, and they just come out with one channel, one account, social media account, as opposed to the multitude of accounts that these influencers have, is that effective to overcome what these influencers are saying and the presence and visibility they have?
No, it's not. And that's why, so first of all, I think it's valuable. It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. It's valuable to do that on its own, to correct the record and to have a document that you can share with the media and with policymakers. But you also need to have a robust science communication strategy that engages communities, and you need to make sure that consensus document is created in a way that's relevant to those communities. You want to co-create content with communities. You want to be on all of those channels. We try to do that with Science Up First. We have wonderful partnerships with immigrant communities, with indigenous communities, with older adults, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to build those partnerships and leverage them to spread the word.
Great, thank you.
Great question. That last two, I guess.
Hi, thanks. I think my question relates to both scientific consensus and AI. And so in the age where people chat GPT or Anthropic's Claude, I'm wondering what are the current sort of process or framework or what's being done to create future AI model that could delineate the scientific consensus versus what may be considered misinformation. Because if we end up, instead of checking social media, if we end up going to Claude or ChatGPT for answers, that may be the next battleground, I suppose, for...
It is for sure. So what about ChatGPT? And by the way, increasingly, I kind of lumping that in online content, right? And people are increasingly going to ChatGPT. That Canadian Medical Association journal showed another interesting paradox amongst the Canadian population, where they found that the majority of individuals are going to ChatGPT. I can't remember what the number is, like 67%, don't quote me if I got that wrong, of people say they use ChatGPT, but only 20, listen to this, only I think it's 27% say they trust it, but they're still going to it, right? Which is fascinating, right? And that study also found those individuals that use AI are more likely also to report, so self-report, gotta be careful not to overinterpret the data, but still relevant, I think, more likely to report, I think it's 5 times as much more likely to report harm by misinformation. So we have a study coming out in BMJ Open, I think, just in the next couple of weeks, where we look at various topics and how well ChatGPT answered the topic, and what we found is there's a variety of responses. But you know what's fascinating, and this touches on the next frontier point that you made, that's the study that we did. It's my own, our team study. It's going to be out of date. Like when it comes out in a couple of weeks, it'll be out of date because we tried to get it as fast as possible because those algorithms are just evolving so incredibly quickly. So I think ChatGPT, it's not going away. People are always going to be going online to get health information. We've got to educate people on how to engage those topics. So studies pretty well consistently show that ChatGPT is good at things like describe this disease, what is the nature, what's this pharmaceutical product, what is the kind of treatments that are available in general for a disease. But it's much scarier when you're using it to diagnose your own illness, right? Is this cancer? Go to a healthcare provider for that, obviously, for that kind of question. Great question. Last question. Make it a good one. Make it a good one.
That's a lot of pressure. I had a question on the social media portion of the presentation. So I really appreciate all the ways that we could maybe contribute to this battle and all the responses that you provided. And I noticed that quite a few of the social media portions or disconnecting from the internet are very individual.
Yeah.
And I feel like my question is more around is there anything we can do to maybe change the way that social media is pushing the negativity bias or pushing the algorithm to be more on the support all of this misinformation? Because I feel like that's part of it sounds like that's part of the crux of the problem is that you go to all of these websites and all that you see is more and more egregious content because it becomes normalized. But is there a way to kind of reverse that or alter the algorithm to kind of do the opposite perhaps?
So it sounds like you might know this already, but there are researchers who are working on apps that you can put on your phone that do that. Right, and my 2 of my kids are engineers, and one of them's a computer scientist that was working on AI from Microsoft. Boo. She's not here, so she doesn't know. The degree to which that's going to be successful, I think is a question. But this also goes to the regulatory question, right? We should have access to the algorithm to get a sense of how they're doing that, right? And the other thing that you can do is you can give people the skill. So one suggestion that I often make, I should have said this earlier, is when it's an important topic, don't let the news come to you, right? Go and search the news. And that's something I actually try to do. So when I'm looking up things about what's happening in Iran, I don't scroll to get the information because that's the algorithm pushing the information, Trump is dead, information at me. You go to news sources, you go and gather the news yourself, right? And that's a very simple workaround to the algorithm, right? So there are things like that you can do that can make a difference. I do think that the critical thinking skills, teaching people about those, it's incredible how powerful those algorithms are. When I leave here, I'm going to get all of these posts about wind in Regina. because I just experienced it, right? So we definitely need to think of ways that we can meaningfully engage these algorithms, because holy cow, that's what's creating our information environment. Thank you. Thank you so much, you guys. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, University of Regina. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tim. On behalf of the University of Regina, and in particular the Faculty of Arts, I also want to thank all of you for coming out. We have not had a crowd like this for the Lloyd Lecture since well before COVID. And it is so wonderful to see this room full of people who are interested in these kinds of topics. So thank you very, very much.